When you're getting into Linux, it can be overwhelming with how many choices you have to make. But I think the most commonly Googled question for new Linux users is, what distro should I use? But first, we need to answer, what is a distro? And that's what this video aims to do. A Linux distribution, or a distro, is an implementation of Linux. Many different things make up a distro, but the main two starting points are the repositories the distribution uses and the package manager. So, you're probably asking, what is a repository? Repositories, or more commonly repos, are internet-hosted locations that let you download packages for your distro. Packages can be small things like utilities or entire applications. For example, if you need to install GIMP and you go to your distribution's repositories, there's a good chance you're going to find a package there called GIMP. The package manager would then be able to install GIMP and manage any future updates that got pushed to the repos. You can almost think of repositories as a library of packages. So let's talk a little bit more about package managers. What is a package manager? So like we talked about with GIMP, package managers will use the repositories a distribution has and install new packages that the user requests or update packages as they become available. Another key area that package managers help out with is dependencies. Oftentimes packages will need dependencies to install and work properly. This is a look at the OBS Studio package in Arch Linux. As of right now, it needs 27 dependencies to make this package work. So when you went to install OBS Studio in Arch, the package manager would be able to help manage those dependencies, make sure they were there, and if they weren't there, download them. Some very common package managers are apt, DNF, and Pacman, though there are many others out there. The really cool thing about a distro is you can change many different things about it to make it your own. However, the types of packages that the distribution supports natively, as well as the package manager, are generally things that you cannot change. Though there are distributions that are blurring the lines on this now, but that's a discussion for a different video. So you may be asking, why are there so many distros? And to me, a proper answer to this probably deserves its own video. But in short, because someone felt the need to create the distro. Maybe they couldn't find one that fit their use case. Then again, we have distros like Hannah Montana Linux. Why does it exist? Your guess is as good as mine. And yes, by the way, Hannah Montana Linux is real. It is very old now. I would not use it unless you just want to play around with it in a VM, because it's woefully out of date. So what are the distros to watch? And well, that's a tricky question because that answer can change quite dramatically depending on what you're looking for. What I can tell you at this point though, is there are 4 kind of main families of distros. There are others beyond these, but these are the big ones that you probably want to look at when starting out. First is Arch. The package type is package. I guess they didn't have the, creative name, but the package manager is Pacman. Pacman package. I guess it makes sense. The next family is Debian and Ubuntu. They use .deb packages and use the apt package manager. Oftentimes, if you're looking at older commands, you may see apt-get. This is the most common kind of family that people end up starting in. My 2 recommended distros for people to start with are Linux Mint and Pop! OS. Both of them are Ubuntu based. There is a slight difference between Debian and Ubuntu, but it gets a little complicated. Generally, Debian is more focused on free software, so they're not as likely to include some proprietary codecs and things like that by default. It makes it more difficult for a newer user to get into, but there is some advantages to going with Debian over Ubuntu. But that is, again, an entirely different video. We could go down many different avenues with this. The next one is Red Hat and Fedora. I list these both because Red Hat Enterprise Linux is kind of the gold standard, or has been the gold standard, when it comes to enterprise level Linux. IBM bought Red Hat for an obscene amount of money several years ago, and Red Hat is still the kind of dominant force when it comes to enterprise Linux. Fedora is the community edition where oftentimes new changes are tried out. So Fedora is often leading the way. It was one of the first distributions to try to make Wayland the default. It also was one of the first to try to make Pipewire the default. This uses the RPM package type, and the package manager is DNF. Previously, they had a package manager called Yum. And the last one that sometimes people forget is SUSE. It's most commonly seen for home users as OpenSUSE, either Tumbleweed or Leap. One thing is a little bit confusing about it at times is that it also uses the package format of RPM, but it uses the package manager called Zypper, Z-Y-P-P-E-R. But as you can see, as we've been kind of scrolling through this list, there are many distro families. Some are now completely dead. Others just don't get as much press and are still out there. But there is a Linux distribution out there for you, depending on what you're trying to do. If you're finding value in this, consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. If you want the inside scoop of what's coming next and more Linux tips, consider signing up for the newsletter. I have a link to that in the description. What you can see is the distro family tree, courtesy of Distrowatch. You'll see Debian and Ubuntu and Fedora and all of these, but you'll also see many other smaller families out there. There are examples like Solus that is still going. There are others where it's kind of died out, and there's others where it's become something a little bit different than it started with. But the point is, there are many different distro families out there. It just depends on how deep into the weeds you want to get. You may be asking next, what are the differences in these distros? Unfortunately, that's not exactly a simple answer. The differences in distros can vary widely. It could be that you can find two distributions, generally in the same family, or you can use the same support documents for both. And for the Ubuntu family, that's fairly common. A lot of times, if you're looking for something about Ubuntu, or you're looking for something about Mint or Pop! OS, and you find something about Ubuntu, you can likely use that document. You just need to check and be sure, but a decent bit of the time you can. Other times, you may have two distros that are a bit different, and you may have to translate between them. For example, if you're looking for some information and you find it in the ArchWiki, and you're running Fedora, you're probably going to have to do some translation to get that information to cooperate with Fedora. But on its head, you've probably at least got a good general direction to try to go in. However, there may be other times where the distro you're using requires an entirely different approach. But like I say, generally, distros in the same family are more similar to each other than distros that are not in the same family. So one other thing you may have heard is rolling and stable releases. And you're like, rolling, stable, what are we talking about? It's a very good question. Stable releases, or sometimes called point releases, are generally released at a cadence. Maybe it's every 6 months, maybe it's every year, but there are major updates that happen in those releases. The updates that you download from day to day, week to week, are generally much smaller and much fewer than a rolling release, which we'll get to next. But oftentimes the updates that you're getting in those daily and weekly updates, they're things like security, maybe some hardware enablement, things like that. There's not going to be major changes. Once it's time for the next point release, you will have to do a process to upgrade to the next point release. Rolling releases, meanwhile, may have a number tied to them, generally not, but their new ISOs are more about getting up-to-date packages for a new install. The frequency of update for rolling releases is much higher. It also is going to introduce a lot more change. We're talking new versions of desktop environments, new versions of Wayland, new versions of Pipewire, even new versions of the Linux kernel. You may be saying, I really like new stuff, but the downside of all this new stuff is that sometimes you can actually end up breaking your system and having to do some digging to get things working again. Personally, I've had pretty good luck with rolling releases. Some people will go and say, never run a rolling release, it's just going to break on you. I kind of think that's overblown. While I wouldn't recommend a rolling release to a new user, I would encourage you to use a stable release and try to understand a bit more about how things work. That would probably involve breaking it, by the way. I broke many a distro in my early days in Linux. After that, I think it's up to you as to whether you want to take in the potential overhead that a rolling release has. But for me, as somebody who's trying to do the content creation stuff, a rolling release gives me more opportunities to check out packages faster and things like that. Though that's becoming less of an issue nowadays with stuff like Flatpak. So one other thing you may have heard of is an immutable distro. And what is that? Immutable distros have become much more popular in the last few years. The idea is you have a core that is immutable. You cannot change it. And then you install your applications, your customizations, etc. kind of on top of that. And so any updates to the core are done directly by the distro maintainers, and everybody has the same core, and then you are layering your changes on top of that in various ways. There are a couple of different ideologies on how to do that. Personally, I haven't messed a whole lot with immutable distros. The most I've done with one is with NixOS. I have played around with that. It's a very interesting concept, and I think for certain use cases, it's going to be incredible. But for a lot of people, it's just not necessary. As to whether it's the right fit for you, that's something that you'll know as you get a bit further into Linux. That being said, the immutable distro is something that is evolving. There are some interesting projects out there, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in the idea, to take a look at some of them out there. Hopefully this has given you a much better idea of what a distro is. What other questions do you have about distros? Are there any other questions you have about getting started with the Linux? Sound off in the comments below. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.